Early colonial conflicts. So we had in this class already set up the 13 English colonies. Another group of Europeans arrived after the Spanish in the 15 and 1600s. In the early 1600s, the English arrived, start the first successful English colony at Jamestown, Virginia, 1607. That's followed by the Pilgrims, who arrive in 1620 in New England. Of course, by that time, people at Jamestown had started the House of Burgesses, the first elected representative body in the New World, where voters got together and elected their official representatives to make local laws for them. And in 1620, before the colonists landed, they instituted the Mayflower Compact, which basically said the same thing, that the colonists would get together, elect some leaders, and those leaders would make the local laws for them. The Pilgrims, of course, did not start most of New England. That was the Puritans, who were also coming over to escape religious persecution. And so the Puritans started Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, although New Hampshire was actually started for fishing, sort of to make money. But of course, other people were coming over for religious reasons as well, including those Quakers of Pennsylvania headed up by William Penn. Above them, what had been New Netherlands had been taken over by the British in a war and renamed New York. Of course, Duke of York owed people some money, so he gave them some of his land. They call that New Jersey, after the Jersey Islands back in England. And meanwhile, what had been New Sweden, those settlers asked to be broken off from Pennsylvania, and William Penn agreed, and that became Delaware. Of course, the Quakers were coming over for religious freedom, as had the Puritans. Further down south, in Maryland, the Catholics had started Maryland, again, trying to escape religious freedom and have a better life in the New World. Virginia, of course, had been started in 1607. The King of England, King George, had owed some people some money, and he paid them back by giving them land, which they named after him, Georgia. Eventually, that sort of split between the sort of the poor section of Georgia, northern Georgia, North Carolina. Excuse me. The King of England that owed people money was King Charles. Excuse me, Charles II. And Charles II had given 8 rich individuals some land in the New World to pay them back, and they renamed that land after King Charles, calling it North Carolina and South Carolina. South Carolina became the richest part. Their main exports were rice, tobacco, and indigo. Of course, most of the southern colonies were growing some type of tobacco to sell. Of course, then there was King George, who was nice enough to allow poor people from English jails to arrive in the New World, setting up Georgia. That also served as a buffer zone between Spanish Florida. In case the Spanish tried to attack, they'd have to fight through Georgia before they got to the richer portions of the 13 English colonies. So the English colonies generally set up to make money, like Virginia and the Carolinas and New Jersey and New York and New Hampshire, and of course other colonies set up for religious reasons, like Maryland and like the Puritan colonies and like Pennsylvania. And then, of course, that Georgia, sort of the odd one out, set up as a place for poor people from English jails and as a buffer zone against the Spanish. The colonies were growing and prospering in many different ways, as we have already seen. But even though they were growing and prospering, that did not mean they did not have conflict, because they did. Starting off in the New England colonies, one of the earlier conflicts was over how much power should the government have, especially over religious practices. So eventually in Massachusetts, where the Puritans started, a preacher named Roger Williams became convinced that the government should have little or no power over religion, that whenever government and religion sort of mixed, there was a lot of negative consequences, including wars and a lot of negative conflicts. But since the Puritans in Massachusetts were like the system they had, and the Puritans in Connecticut liked the systems they had, of course, they also allowed non-church members to vote in Connecticut under the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Roger Williams would have to go start his own colony of Rhode Island, the Providence Plantations. So in 1640, a conflict over government and religion led to the starting of Rhode Island and eventually of their religious toleration practice that basically the government should not punish you based upon your religious experiences or your religious beliefs or your lack of religious beliefs. So eventually Rhode Island was home to not only some Puritans but also some Quakers and some Anglicans and some Dutch Reformed church members and some atheists and some other different Jewish groups and some other religions as well. So one of the first starts of course, what we know in our Constitution, the First Amendment, is freedom of religion. Now, moving a little further south, Maryland also had their own problems as far as religious practices were concerned. Catholics had arrived, of course, because it was land grant from the king, and the Catholics felt persecuted in England. They arrived and started off well in Maryland, but as they continued their growth in Maryland, many people from Virginia and the Middle Colonies started to move in, and they were not Catholics. And so the Catholics feared they might be persecuted again, that once the non-Catholics got the majority, that they might be able to elect leaders that might persecute the Catholics. So while the Catholics had power, they passed the Act of Toleration, a religious toleration, which basically stated that the government should not persecute people based on their religious beliefs. Eventually, Maryland became a royal colony administered directly by the king, but the Act of Toleration stayed. Meanwhile, there were other types of conflicts that were a little bit more deadly. That was certainly the case in New England. Of course, New England had been settled by the Puritans and Pilgrims, but of course there have been people living there before, what we call Indians, different groups of Indians were living there before. And at first, for the first 20 or so years, the Puritans and the Pilgrims and the Indians had, if they weren't friends, at least they weren't enemies. They knew they sort of needed each other. And so for a time, New England was somewhat peaceful as far as those aspects were concerned. But then in 1675, a new king, a new chief came to power, one of the major tribes. He called himself King Philip, sort of imitating the English king, so to speak. And he decides that the British and the English and the Puritans are taking up so much land that the Indians need to fight back and get their land back. And it essentially becomes a war of extermination. That is, King Philip hoped that he would basically kill enough Puritans, kill enough British people, they would get on their boats and sail back to England. Obviously, the British in the New England colonies did not want to get back on their boats and sail back to England. And so they fought very hard. It was a very bloody conflict with many atrocities committed on both sides. Eventually, the Indians did manage to kill about 1 out of every 10 men, English men, in the English colonies. However, the English eventually won that war. And for most of the Indian tribes, that meant they had to give up their land and move further west. The Indians that were captured in that war, many of Indians were killed during the war, but some that were captured in the war, the Puritans sent to the West Indies to work as slaves on these sugar plantations there. So King Philip's War was simply an indicator of things to come between the native people and the new immigrants that were moving onto their land. It would not, of course, be the last negative exchange between Indians and the Europeans. Although, again, as proved before, Europeans and Indians could get along, especially if they needed each other. Now comes Bacon's Revolt. Now, of course, you may be wondering why that nice bacon that you might have in the morning might revolt against you, but this was not that type of bacon. It was a man's name, Francis Bacon, and he had arrived in Virginia. Unfortunately, he had arrived a little bit late, and all the good land was taken up. the good land with the fertile soil was around the little river system and tributary systems and the bay in Virginia, and that land had quickly been taken up by the original settlers and the people that had followed them, including some indentured servants who'd already gained their freedom and had already lived there for many years, and they themselves had indentured servants. And so when Miss Francis Bacon arrived, he had to move further west, out towards the mountains. The mountain land was not too good for growing things. You could eke out a living, you could make a little living, but he really resented the fact that he had to live on this sort of poor land, while people in eastern Virginia were very rich with their large houses, with their large number of servants and slaves. Mr. Bacon had to get along with just a couple of servants. And unfortunately, one day when he was gone, he came back and found that a couple of the servants had actually been killed in an Indian attack. So Mr. Bacon then basically sent a message to the governor at Jamestown, Virginia, asking that the governor call out the militia. Of course, the militia was a part-time army that the people in Virginia had. That is sort of like our National Guard today, people with jobs, but when there's an emergency, they leave their jobs and become the army. The governor did not call out the militia because many of the militiamen were sort of rich Englishmen that lived along the coast. And why should they have to fight and die for some poor Englishmen out towards the mountains? So unfortunately, the militia was not called out. Mr. Bacon decided to create his own militia with sort of backcountry people, including some of the poor English that were out towards the mountains, some of their indentured servants, some of their slaves, and they decided to wipe out those Indians that attacked them. Unfortunately, they happened to wipe out the wrong tribe of Indians, because apparently to the English, all Indians look the same. I have no idea why. But they found the wrong Indians and wiped them out. That really angered the governor and the rich people sort of on the East Coast, because they had had sort of friendly relations with the Indians, and now they were concerned that the Indians may attack them. And so this caused quite a dispute between the people in the East and the people in the West. So really it was a conflict between sort of the poor and the rich people in the Tidewater region, so-called because they lived along the bay where the tides came up, and so you could sail a ship up the river and up into your plantation, which means you really didn't have to have many port cities, and versus the poor people in the back country, those people back towards the mountains. So you had the eastern landowners in the East Coast, basically versus, especially in the poor section, the backcountry section, you had farmers, both black and whites. You had servants and you had slaves, all sort of eking out a living, barely making it. And of course, they looked across to their eastern neighbors and saw that they were getting along very well, and that really angered them. The fact that the militia not being called out to protect them, it seemed like there was two standards in Virginia. There was one standard for the very rich and one standard for the poor people. And basically the poor people didn't like that. So Bacon decides to basically get together his militia again and march to Virginia. And at Virginia, he'll arrest the governor and basically make the governor and the legislature pass laws. So Bacon and his sort of poor army start marching towards Jamestown. The governor gets on board a ship and leaves. He of course, basically tells the population of Jamestown that, oh, don't worry, I'm just going north to get some troops, and I'll be back to help you. But nevertheless, the governor left. Just before the army, Bacon's army, the poor people entered into Jamestown, they issued a declaration called the Declaration of the People. In that declaration, they basically stated that they were doing what they were doing because there was no protection against the Indians, that the government was not protecting them, in other words. They also cited that they had unfair taxes. That is, they paid money to the government but got no services from the government. And also that they had no representation in the assembly. So basically the rich people along the coast got to vote on who ran the government, and the poor people out back to the backcountry didn't get a vote on who ran the government. Shortly after issuing the Declaration of the People in 1676, Bacon marched into Virginia with his army and burned it to the ground. Now, eventually, the governor did arrive back with British troops, but by that time, Bacon had died of disease. And the rest of the poor people had sort of abandoned their quest, and the backcountry people had moved and had sort of left the East Coast and moved back towards the mountains to where their homes were. So the rebellion failed. But it's important to realize that 100 years later, after the Declaration of the People, after Bacon's revolt, there would be another revolt, and there would be another declaration. In 1776, that declaration basically said the people are not protected by the government. They're paying for the government, but they're not getting services from the government. That declaration basically saying that there are unfair taxes, that they didn't get a vote on these taxes. They had no representation in the assembly. So many of the same things that were in the Declaration of People in 1676, 100 years later, those problems were still there. Of course, in 1676, it was called the Declaration of Independence, because 100 years after Bacon, the people were declaring their independence from Britain because of these grievances, because of these problems. So problems don't usually go away without them being solved. Usually problems just get worse and worse until they explode on you. So oftentimes it's better to solve problems while you can until unless they get out of control, and then it's a little bit too late. Meanwhile, a little bit further up north, in 1692, there was other conflicts, basically between rich and poor people, in what's called the Salem witchcraft trials. Again, there were land disputes over the town of Salem and the village of Salem. And the town of Salem basically had the port where all the ships came in and were sort of rich. And further inland was the village of Salem, where they were sort of poor, and they sort of resented all the rich people. And again, they sort of paid their taxes, but they didn't get many services. And there were other problems associated with this as well. But eventually, some of the poor people started accusing some of the richer people of witchcraft, which was a crime under English law. Unfortunately, at this time, because some problems with Indian attacks earlier on, there was no governor in Massachusetts, and so the legal system is sort of broken down. So when you accuse someone of being a witch at this time, you could basically say that, and basically say you didn't actually have to see them, or people didn't actually have to see them do something bad to you. You could just sort of dream it, and your dreams counted as testimony. Simply because you sort of thought it happened to you, it did happen to you. So eventually, close to 200 people were accused, and the jails were full. Eventually, they get a new governor. After 28 people are convicted and 20 are killed, 19 by hanging, and one was what they call pressed to death. That is, that person would not actually say he was guilty or innocent of being a witch, so they were actually putting stones on his chest to get him to say one way or another, and eventually those stones crushed his chest. But the witches were hung, or the accused witches were hung, excuse me, here in Massachusetts, Salem. Now, by the way, over in Europe, when you were found guilty of witchcraft, they actually burned you. Generally, sometimes they executed and chopped off your head, or sometimes they hung you, but oftentimes they burned you, but not here in America. But having said that, very quickly the trials were ending, especially because the religious leaders at the time were taking a stand against this witchcraft trial. They were basically saying that the legal system was broken, that just because people dreamed something happened didn't mean it really happened, what they call spectral evidence, and that basically evidence should be based on real facts, in other words. So eventually the legal system was changed, and eventually most of the victims and their families were compensated for being thrown in jail or having their family members killed. But it did show that in this new land, there were many different types of conflicts going on. That also included, in New York, problems over freedom of the press. So a New York newspaper, published by a guy named John Ziegler, accused the governor of New York of ruling unfairly. It basically called the governor some names and basically called him basically a thief. And the governor did not like that, so he ordered the newspaper shut down, and he ordered the publisher, John Ziegler, arrested and thrown in trial for libel. Libel means that people have said bad things about you. So eventually when John Ziegler was brought to trial, he was actually defended by a guy named Alexander Hamilton, who later becomes famous in American history. But during this trial, the jury finds him not guilty. And basically the law at the time was that if you said something bad about the governor, you were guilty, whether it was true or not. But the jury basically found him not guilty and said the law needs to be changed. That is, if you say something bad about a person and it's true, then you should not be held accountable and thrown in jail simply because you told the truth. On the other hand, of course, if you said bad things about a person and they're untrue, then you should be held accountable. So the outcome was a statement, even if defamatory, even if it sounds bad, is not libelous. You can't act on it. You can't throw people in jail if it can be proven true. So if the statement's true, they can't put you in jail for it. They can't sue you for it, or they can sue, but supposedly they cannot actually win. If the statement is actually false that you make against someone, then those persons generally can sue you and generally can win. So the outcome of this is more freedom of the press, which again is found in our First Amendment. Also during all this time, when all these other things are going on, there were many other types of conflicts, including some physical conflicts, including slave revolts. Or I guess we should call it servant revolts, because sometimes it's not just the slaves that had been brought in from out of the country that were revolting. Sometimes it was the servants in the country that was revolting as well. So, for example, in 1663 in Virginia, about 30 white indentured servants and a few slaves planned an uprising against their masters. They planned to kill their masters because their masters have been treating them so poorly, giving them terrible food, things like that. But the plot failed, and 4 of them were executed. Eventually in 1712, there's another sort of somewhat famous slave revolt. This time it was basically a slave revolt, not a indentured servant revolt. But about 30 slaves went around, and they decided to kill people because they were sort of fed up with being slaves. But the plot failed, and 21 of those slaves were executed. 21 of those people that were caught in the act of actually killing other people, or basically urging others to kill those people. They were arrested, and eventually 21 were killed, and the slave resurrection ended in failure. Just about 25 years later, in 1739, in South Carolina, again there was a sort of a plot, an uprising. This time the slaves going to kill their masters and perhaps seek freedom. They hoped that after they killed their masters, they would be able to move into Georgia and then move into Florida, which was Spanish. And Florida, because it was Spanish at the time, technically wasn't allowing slavery. So they hoped that if they could get to Florida, they'd be free. But during the uprising, there were about 100 of these slaves that were involved in the plot, and they did manage to kill about 20 people that were not in the plot. That is, they killed their masters and their families, etc. But the plot has essentially failed, and 44 of those slaves were executed. Just a few years later in New York, there was another conspiracy. Basically, again, many people were sort of upset that they were treated so badly in life, and that they didn't see a way out. So this time about 100 slaves and poor free whites burned down part of the city. Their whole purpose was basically to burn the city down, to express their displeasure at life. So this time it wasn't just the slaves, it was also free whites that were somewhat poor and really resented that rich New Yorkers weren't helping them. And so they did manage to burn down part of the city, but the plot failed. 30 slaves and 4 free whites were executed. So during the colonial times, the colonies were growing in many different ways. They were growing economically and they were growing spiritually in the Great Awakening. They were growing societal-wise. There were more cities, there were more people, but there were also conflicts during this time. So even though there was much growth and progress in 13 colonies from their start in 1607 until independence, there was also violence and trouble. There were religious, economic, racial, ethnic, and societal conflicts throughout the colonial period. However, as we'll see, the ultimate colonial conflict would be a war for independence. And we'll continue looking at the 13 colonies and how eventually they break away from the mother country, England, and become the United States of America.